My name is Spencer Walsh. Welcome to an all-new episode of Newsflash. On today's show, in Louisiana, Donald Trump dealt a tough loss in a deep red and reddening state as an incumbent Democrat narrowly beats a Trump-endorsed Republican candidate. Also, we'll take a look at 2020. What is going on with the left wing of the Democratic Party? Bernie Sanders and Ocasio-Cortez defend their, what some might say, far left-wing positions, and Elizabeth Warren is starting to sound a lot like someone who is named Pete Buttigieg on the subject of Medicare for All. How this dramatic change happened, we'll discuss that and a lot more on today's episode. But I do want to start with some of the most important news, I think, coming out recently, and it really is some pretty solid news for the Democrats, with a solid pickup in Louisiana, or solid hold in Louisiana, I guess you would call it, because the governor there, the incumbent governor, John Bel Edwards, a rare Democratic governor in the South, he was reelected for a second term, beating a challenger heavily supported by President Trump, which was a big test of Donald Trump's popularity that just didn't turn out well. It was incredibly close. It was a second, and this is, again, it's been the second time the New York Times reports here at the ballot box for Trump this month in a Republican-leading state, following the Democratic victory in the Kentucky governor's race, where the president also campaigned for the GOP candidate. So, that was Governor Matt Bevin. He wagered some pretty significant political capital to try to lift Eddie Risbon, a businessman who ran against Edwards in large part by embracing the president and his agenda. Trump campaigned for Risbon twice in the final 2 weeks of the race, warning Louisiana voters that a loss would reflect poorly on his presidency, the same appeal he made in Kentucky earlier this month to try to help Governor Matt Bevin, who ultimately lost. And again, we talked about this, I think, a show ago or 2 shows ago, is the fact that a lot of the times these demographics are so rapidly changing, and there's more suburban voters, and suburban voters, even in counties like, for example, flipping it back to 2015, Jackson Parish was a very great example of this. It was a suburban county that narrowly went for the Republican the last time around, who was, again, pretty scandalous, but still went for the Republican. So, I mean, if it was probably the less scandal-ridden Republican who was running against Bel Edwards in 2015, he probably could have gone for more. So the idea that I'm trying to say here is that Jackson Parish, that was a pretty heavily Republican district. Now it went for the Democrat here by double digits. It's a huge turn in the right direction for the Democrats in this area, and it's something that really could, if things go right, deliver them this state further down the road, and is a continuing trend that we saw in both Virginia, we saw in Kentucky, and we're seeing again here in Louisiana. It's the turn of Trump voters, or not Trump voters, but traditional Republicans away from Donald Trump for whatever reason. And what I really question is how genuine, how specific, how we've seen this happen since 2018, but what does this look like after Trump? Do they just turn back to the respectable Republican, or do they just look away? Because I really feel like when we hear about suburban flipping, when we hear about massive flipping of suburban districts, and this has been happening all the way since the 2018 midterms. It didn't work with someone like Hillary Clinton, but it has worked in multiple other times with other candidates, and it's normally done by more moderate Democrats. In this case, John Bel Edwards was a very moderate Democrat. You have to wonder, what impact will it hold? What kind of benefit will this really, what benefit will this hold, and for how long is really the question. While Edwards does consider himself, and I think the record does back this up, he is a very conservative Democrat, he did campaign on his accomplishments in office, such as balancing the budget, increasing education spending, and expanding Medicaid. So those things as well as his conservative stances on abortion and guns, showcased his background as a West Point graduate and son of a sheriff to appeal to some of the right-leaning voters. And again, this is not going to be a strategy that's going to work for every election. You can't just go out there and say, I am anti-abortion, like, as a presidential, like, it's I think everyone realizes that it's something that's going to be state-specific. It's just going to be the reality of the situation. So, like, it's not always going to be a massive win for you if you come out, for example, in Massachusetts and take an anti-abortion stance. But these kind of playing the right tricks, it's gonna be very effective. But it's going to be interesting to see what he will do, because it's very, very likely that he won't always be the best ally to Democratic causes, even with a D next to his name. That's the thing that Democrats need to come to terms with, and I think are, in a large degree, coming to terms with certain, at varying points and varying speeds all over the country, is what is it, like, how important is the letter next to your name if you're supporting the policies that Republicans support, and or refusing to stand up for policies that a lot of Democrats support. And we saw this coming out in presidential politics with new polls from Iowa saying overwhelmingly, and this is really a fascinating concept that exists nowhere else in American politics, but with Democratic voters, like, they agree largely on substance with people like Elizabeth Warren, and less so with, like, Pete Buttigieg and Joe Biden. But the reason why they get so much support, the Buttigieg and Joe Bidens of the world, is because they overwhelmingly worry, Democratic voters do, about this guy in Michigan, this elusive white guy in Michigan who's going to come in and say, I don't like him, he's too far left. Like, they vote for other people is what I'm trying to say here. They don't really vote for themselves. They don't really vote for their priorities. It's such a internalization of propaganda, I think, for the mainstream media, and this is really what's been so successful for them, is the idea that it's only the Democrats that have to worry about how they're perceived and how electable, quote unquote, that they may be. I mean, the most right-wing Republican could run in no matter what situation. No one will really bat an eye, because that's just the Republican Party. Like, they push their boundaries further and further. Like, it's the same principle as the Overton window. And for so long, these people in the media have said this exact same thing. Like, we never hear, oh, you can't be too far to the right. You hear that, but barely as much as you hear the constant barrage of criticism saying that people, oh, they're too far to the left, they're too far to the left. There was a hashtag trending on Twitter talking about hashtag too far left, and why maybe it's just okay to be a little bit further to the left than what you might think is socially acceptable. And that is a idea that I think is changing, and for good reason, because it's time that Democrats, like, they stop believing the idea about the media, because it's just the continuous desire. And Ryan Grimm talked about this very interestingly on an interview that we did with him back this past May, I think May or June or something like that. Like, that is the same idea. The idea that the constant drive in the Democratic Party to try and appease someone else, to think about November, think about what's going to work in the general election, and how will a certain set of voters that don't represent me or my parties, how will they be satisfied? And they pick candidates based on that. And I think that's really something that will be challenging but necessary for the Bernie Sanders types, the Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez types, to try and dissuade people of. So it's definitely a good, solid win for the Democrats. No matter, a win is a win, but I think it's going to be worth watching this guy and what he does. And I think we'll probably have a pretty good idea if you look. I mean, not much is going to change in Louisiana, but a lot of those. I think the most important part of this election is the takeaways that Democrats had in these suburban districts. But again, I really think that support is some of the shakiest support that you can have, because it's former Republicans that are only being turned off because of Trump. Like, they have no other reason socioeconomically to support the Democratic Party, especially as it moves further to the left. when there's a much more solid Republican option. Because why vote Republican light when you can vote actual Republican? Like, there needs to be a convincing alternative in mainstream politics all across the country, and there just isn't right now. There is becoming so more and more every day, I feel like, but time and time again, there is a real debate about where this party is headed. So I think it's very, very interesting to take a look at that. So, all right, yeah, and we do want to get to a story, interestingly enough, on this exact same topic with Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, and reaction to some of these fascinating comments made by President Barack Obama, which I do want to get to. For those of you who don't know, it was really a pretty fascinating story in the New York Times with Barack Obama wading into the Democratic primary for the first time after we heard he kind of refused to endorse Joe Biden because Joe Biden, quote unquote, asked him not to. Okay, I guess that's probably one of the more amusing things to me, that Joe Biden, who has staked so much of his reputation on the endorsement, the ever-present love of Barack Obama, wouldn't want that to aid him. But again, so this is in the New York Times from a few days ago about former President Barack Obama offered an unusual warning to the Democratic primary field on Friday evening, cautioning the candidates not to move too far to the left in their policy proposals, even as he sought to reassure a party establishment worried about the electoral strength of their historically large primary field. So, again, this is the representative, as it's very representative of the crazy and somewhat hilarious idea with the Democratic establishment that there is no good candidate for us. And when I talk about the Democratic establishment, it's a very, very small group of people. It's people who really are at the top of the top. They are people who hold these Stop Bernie Sanders meetings. They're politicians who are incredibly disconnected, Wall Street guys, private equity, like the rich of the rich, who just happen to have probably a socially liberal leaning. And those are the people who support Democratic campaigns and have been fueling the Democratic Party, funding the Democratic Party for far too long, giving it the disastrous and in-the-tank brand that it has today. But this is, again, a great sentence here. Speaking before a room of wealthy liberal donors, Obama urged Democrats to remember the long, combative slog of his primary campaign against Hillary Clinton in 2008, arguing that the 16-month battle ultimately made him a stronger general election candidate. And again, that is a good point to have. I think it's a very obvious point that primary strength in a candidate, you want a candidate that's battle tested, ready to go in the general. I think that's it's sound logic. And that's why I support primaries, even when there is a progressive incumbent being challenged, like the Massachusetts Senate race, like Ed Markey and Joe Kennedy III. But he says, for those who get stressed about robust primaries, I just have to remind you that I had a very robust primary. He told the group of several hundred donors and organizational leaders in Washington. I'm confident that at the end of the process, we will have a candidate that has been tested. Yeah, but it wasn't all peaches and rainbows. He raised some concerns about some of the liberal ideas being promoted by some candidates, citing healthcare and immigration as issues where the proposals may have gone further than public opinion. So, yeah, again, God forbid someone goes any further than public opinion. Like, we must have the polls on our side at all times because, that's what's going on. We have to have, again, the polls largely do support even the most left-wing policies in Democratic politics, but just the idea that you can't fight for something just because it's not popular in the public opinion, which is certainly what this seems to imply here, just goes against everything that Barack Obama, and this is where it is in highlights here, campaigned on. Not the way he governed, because this is a very, very, I do want to get to some of this Cornell West. Cornell West had a great article here in The Guardian about all this stuff, and it's so accurate in comparison to, and really representative of what I think has happened with Barack Obama, and perfectly sums up my opinions on it. I do want to get to that next, but here's what he said here. He was talking about healthcare, immigration, and all that, but Obama did not single out a specific primary candidate or policy proposal. We all know who he was talking about. And this is very funny. He's talking about Twitter fingers. Democrats, independents, and moderate Republicans are not driven by the same views reflected on certain left